Hey, I've seen this one. This is a classic.
What do you mean you've seen this? It's brand new.
So a few years back now, I took a look at a game named Haydee 2, a survival horror / crushing Metroidvania made by more or less a single person, where you played as a cybernetically and ballistic enhanced cyborg, navigating through a confusing hellhole trying to find a way to escape. It was insanely complex, dark, challenging and grim, but overall kinda fun at times. And if lately you found yourself pining for more of the video game equivalent of having someone crush your nuts in a vice, well, then I've got good news for you. Because the developers just brought out a sequel, Haydee 3. Even though I'm not really sure I'd call it a sequel, considering it's really more of a map pack or an expansion, with none of the core systems having really been updated or improved upon, and in a lot of ways it's arguably even worse off. Somehow being even more confusing than the second game, if that was even possible. And after beating this thing twice, I'm not even sure if I'd call it a masterpiece or the worst game ever made. But one thing's definitely for sure, and that there's nothing else out there quite like it at the moment. Now again, like the last two games in the series, there's not really any kind of storyline or overarching plot progression. The long and the short of it is that you're just another one of these cyborgs trapped inside this facility, after there's been some kind of event that's left the entire place abandoned. Playing as a new model this time called Natatha, waking up in the medical wing before then having to slowly explore the entire base bit by bit. Moving back and forth between all these different branches of the facility like engineering, administration, and technical, as you find new items and unlock new shortcuts. You got the old manual save system, you've got item boxes, crafting ammo, along with a high focus on conserving it and your health items. You know, just all that good survival horror stuff. And it's all very reminiscent of how the second and the first game played. Though I will say that one of the first things I noticed is that the playable character looks a lot more conservative now. I mean, like, don't get me wrong, she's still got an ass that could be used to smother a grown man to death, and it also looks like she's smuggling a couple of bowling balls under her shirt. But she is definitely showing a lot less skin than she was last time, and her face is arguably worse off as well. Now my guess here is that the devs maybe done this in the hopes that people might take the game a bit more seriously this time and not just look at it at face value. Which does make a bit of sense given the response that the second game had, and even more sense when you look back on the first. Having said all that, the game is still rife with images of busty, undressed women and is uncensored by default, with some of the enemy types even being naked. Not to mention every single vending machine has a naked lady on it, and if the old saying that sex sells is true, well, then soda sales within this facility must be through the goddamn roof. Plus it also brings back all of those really bizarre video game posters with adult themes, like, yeah, who could forget the all-time classic Mad Dad Erection 2? Or how about the newest releases with boob rain and swinging dongs? I don't know, I guess that's supposed to be a reference to sleeping dogs, but swinging dongs? That don't make any sense.
That doesn't make sense.
I think you'll find that I don't give a fuck!
One of the coolest visual details, I think, though, is how you keep coming across all these corpses for other cyborgs who've met their demise before you got there. Really highlighting how hostile the environment really is, and also making you feel like just another test subject caught in this horrible rat's maze. So thematically, and visually at least, you can't deny that Haydee 3 is still very unique, with lighting that really reminds me of a bygone era where every single game seemed to have stencil shadows, and the way that the lights projected through floor grates along with some of the real-time reflections really does look pretty awesome. Load times are fast as well, especially when entering new rooms, and I didn't have a single crash in the 30 hours that I spent with it. As for the new features, well, the two main things that Haydee 3 adds in is both platforming and swimming. Now, to be fair, the platforming was already there in the first game to begin with. In fact, it played a pretty damn huge component in that game overall, but then was weirdly absent from the second game. Well, not anymore.
Not anymore.
Now, the controls for this can seem pretty tricky at first, and in fact, the whole tutorial sequence has arguably some of the toughest platforming in the entire game. But then once you get the hang of how the whole thing works, it's actually kind of easy. And I definitely found these some of the most enjoyable puzzles in the entire game. Mostly. If not just for the fact that I didn't have enemies popping out of the walls every 2 seconds to ambush me while I was doing it. It's all very reminiscent of old school Prince of Persia type stuff where you really need to slow down and make these precise jumps. Even slowly backing off ledges ass first to prevent fall damage. Because if you're even slightly off hitting something dead center, well, then your character simply ignores it and you just fall to your death. Oh yeah, and your character must have some pretty damn good forearm strength too, because falling from any kind of height really seems to shred your legs up. Yeah, but then for some reason you can drop down and grab a ledge and entire floor down and seem to suffer no damage at all.
Damn.
Then the other mechanic they've added in is the swimming, which you need to worry about far less, but thankfully again is actually kinda decent. I mean, this could have gone south real quick, and there's plenty of games out there where the swimming controls pretty much turn into the fun police, completely tanking any sense of enjoyment and kind of discouraging you from actually wanting to explore these underwater areas. Thankfully here though, this ain't the case, so yeah, that's a good thing. The vast majority of the gameplay though is going to be you having to defend yourself against all the various hostiles inside the facility. And like the other games, you got a pistol, a submachine gun, a shotgun, and then a rifle, with all of them looking visually like they're made out of plastic. Which is ironic, considering that's what it feels like the bullets are made out of. Because yet again, the shooting just feels really weak and unexciting, with there being very little impact and it kind of seeming like the bullets are being propelled by queefs. There's not that much to say about any of these either. I mean, your pistol's going to be your standard go-to weapon for most of the game, only because it's the one you're always going to have ammo for. Then it more or less goes in order of the SMG, the shotgun, and then the rifle in terms of ammo frequency. You can find some basic upgrade kits hidden away in secret places which upgrades the damage, the firing rate, and the ammo capacity. And you're definitely going to want to save these for either the rifle or the shotgun. As for the enemies, well, much like the weapons, there's only 4 in total. You got these slower moving zombie types who just kind of slowly walk towards you and then attack you when they're close enough. And there ain't too much strategy in dealing with these guys, aside from just shooting them in the head until they go down. There's also like a tougher variant who are these big fatter assholes who also can spit out acid. And these guys take a few more shots, but again, the same strategy kind of applies. The ones you really need to worry about are the praying mantis ones who've got blades for arms, because these things move a lot quicker, and they can often stun lock you to death. As well as these pregnant looking zombie things as well, which don't seem threatening at first, but have the incredibly annoying habit of exploding at point blank range, which pretty much always kills you in a single hit.
Oh wow, they are terrible.
Oh yes, they're quite awful.
Now, whilst none of these enemies are inherently bad or poorly designed, the problem is how they're integrated into the game, in the sense that they're always put into rooms in a way to catch the player off guard. The most common way it happens is when you flip a switch or walk over some kind of invisible trigger, and then one of them's going to burst out of a vent or somewhere nearby, promptly running towards you to attack. And if you somehow don't hear the audio cue or can't locate which direction they're coming from, well, you can be up shit creek without a paddle real quick. Like there's one point when you're locked inside a bathroom while enemies pop out of the vents and nearby cubicles. Another one is inside this so-called bot arena, where you've got to rotate valves, while again, the enemies just keep popping out of the nearby walls to attack you. And yes, like it does sound fine on paper, and enemy ambushes are the cornerstone of good survival horror. The thing is, if you don't know this is coming or where they're coming from, which chances you're not going to on a blind playthrough, well, then it is very easy to get quickly overwhelmed and killed. Especially considering your character still controls like a rhinoceros on roller skates. And I would say that for probably 50% of the time when I got ambushed in a room like this, I would end up dying. Because I just wasn't prepared for it, and I sure as hell couldn't get out of the way fast enough. I just really can't overstate how much this happens. And even on my second playthrough, I was still shocked at how many times it caught me off guard. And yes, like I know that this was also something that happened a lot in the other games, but that doesn't really make it any better. I mean, if anything, that's actually a negative. because you really hope that the developer would have found a more interesting way to make the game challenging. It's not really helping either how easily it is to get stun-locked or pushed back and trapped in corners, where about all you can do at that point is just wait for death's cold embrace.
That's right, motherfucker. Game over.
Oh yeah, and to make it even more lame, it'll often spawn in enemies from opposite sides of the room. So it's like while you're facing one way and shooting at one of them, another one's going to come at you from behind. And with the case of those exploding kamikaze type enemies, half the time I didn't even see it coming. That's what she said. A big component of the combat is also placing down proximity mines, which kill most of these standard enemies in a single hit. And a lot of this stuff is almost putting these down preemptively after you've died in a room, and you're going in there for a second time where you've now got the foresight to place them down strategically. There is a new dodge move is added into the game where you can roll around if you press the jump button while aiming with a weapon. And it is a nice addition and it's saved my ass a few times, but it's not anywhere near as effective as it really should have been. And it doesn't seem to have iframes either, meaning enemies are still going to hit you regardless. So yeah, goody gumdrops. The other problem with the shooting is that the enemies don't always flinch when you hit them, which then doesn't really slow them down when they're coming towards you. I mean, like, as a point of comparison, go and look at, you know, more or less every single other survival horror game ever made to see how it should look. Even something as old as the original RE4, where that simple detail of enemies recoiling and being staggered by your shots added a much needed layer of fairness. Not to mention the ability to essentially manage small groups and keep their distance. Or as another example, like, imagine if in the older RE games, hunters didn't get knocked back when you hit them with the shotgun. I mean, it'd be anarchy. I did a video on another indie survival horror title a while back called The Killing Antidote, and this is a great example of what I'm talking about. How the zombies would realistically react to getting hit by bullets, which would throw them off balance and give you a lot more breathing room and crowd control. Now look, in fairness, they do react after like every second or third shot, and the shotgun almost always staggers enemies. But it just feels like a bit of an overlooked feature, which really should have been incorporated a whole lot better. But you want to know the thing that really pisses me off here, which is something the other games also did, is how enemies don't reset when you leave and re-enter the rooms. And again, you know how in like every single other survival horror game ever made, how when you leave a room and re-enter it, enemies' positions have reset, and they aren't standing right in front of the door anymore and blocking you in. Yeah, well, in Haydee 3, enemies are going to be standing exactly where you left them. Which means if you left the room and enemies happen to be standing right near the entrance, well, when you go back in there half an hour later, they're still going to be there. To the point that you can almost softlock yourself out of certain rooms if you're not careful. There are a few times where you can sneak around if you don't aggro them beforehand, but usually once you're in that room, everything is coming after you. Which at least does make sense. I mean, realistically, based off your character's physique, there'd be no chance for subterfuge there at all. With those thunder thighs slapping around so loudly, they'd probably register on the Richter scale. By far though, the most annoying thing, yet again, is the abundance of explosive mines hidden away in random dark corners, just waiting to be stepped on by first-time players. Where again, a lot of the time you're not even going to have a chance to see them before you're killed.
It was at this moment that he knew. He fucked up.
Pass.
I still remember playing through the second game and how I literally lost my voice from yelling at it so much. And although I'm happy to say that the same thing didn't happen this time, it still came pretty damn close.
Are you shitting me?
And it just can't be overstated how much of an incredibly challenging game Haydee 3 often is. Even on the so-called softcore mode, the tutorial is likely going to stump most players, and probably even turn them off playing this thing to even begin with. In fact, according to the Steam achievements, only 50% of the people who own the game even got past it. I actually came pretty close there to doing the same thing myself during a bit where I got stuck in this one room for like 10 minutes. before I realized I could grab this ledge over there. Yeah, you see that ledge over there that's got a bunch of shit hanging off it? Well, apparently it can still be grabbed.
What have I got?
But the biggest aspect to the Haydee 3 experience is just trying to figure out where the fuck you're supposed to be going. And it's the kind of game where you spend hours walking around the same few looking rooms over and over, trying to find the means to progress. The main objective is to find 4 power cores or batteries or whatever so you can escape this facility. And you find one very early on during the tutorial, but for the other 3, you're going to need to explore all these other areas. Now, the biggest continuous puzzle throughout all of this is this whole overarching one, where you need to redirect 3 different power lines. You've got a red one, a green one, and a blue one, which then unlocks smaller, sectioned off areas. And throughout most of this, you can't even carry your weapons, and have to drop them outside this gate, forcing you to evade the enemies inside until you leave. Oh yeah, and not only do you have to try to figure out how to get the power moving in the right direction, but often also avoid enemies at the same time. And I probably spent a good 5 or 6 hours in this part of the map alone, just completely dumbfounded. Backtracking back to that main relay room and trying to reconfigure the flow for the different power lines until the whole thing made sense. Then hauling ass, literally, back to the no weapon zone to hope the whole thing matched up. At one point I was convinced that I'd somehow soft-locked the game, only to realise that because of my fucking colour blindness, I hadn't realised that this one part here was actually green and not red.
What a fucking loser!
But even then, like, this is just like one of a half a dozen different sections you need to figure out. It's the kind of thing where you really need to make a mental and physical note of what you're up to. And in fact, the first time I stopped playing this and went to bed, I spent a few minutes jotting down what I'd done and where I had to go to next, so when I woke up, I'd remember what I was doing. Yeah, it's like I literally gave the future version of myself cliff notes so I wouldn't forget where I was.
And here comes the hard part, old buddy. Now it is all up to you.
Great.
And it really is one of those instances where people are either going to love it or hate it. I was kind of fortunate that I had the dev's email, and I was emailing this guy every few hours when I felt like I'd hit another roadblock, hoping he could give me a few clues. Oh yeah, and a big shout out to him, by the way, for being so awesome. In fact, he even patched my version of the game because I ran into a soft lock and it essentially fucked up my playthrough. What's not really helping either is that much like the first and the second game, there's still no item descriptions and still no proper in-game map. So the only way you can ever get used to the layout is just by getting stuck there long enough to the point that you finally piece everything together in your brain through sheer repetition. Even after having done that though, it's still more than easy to miss a crucial item, a door, or some kind of area where you need to go. For instance, like picking up one of the many key cards and trying to remember what it unlocks, or any of the vague, undescribed items that give you no clues. Like this kitchen knife, for instance, which only has a single use: to cut through this very Resident Evil inspired yellow tape. During one of the many times I found myself running around for what felt like hours, I'd once again scoured the entire map trying to find what I'd missed, feeling like I'd really exhausted all possible routes, only to finally realise I'd missed a single hole in the wall somewhere that I could use the crowbar on, which then let me progress onward just that little bit further. And same thing even earlier than that when I found the bolt cutters. I mean, I ran around for what felt like an eternity trying to find all the spots to use it, to then finally find the solution back in the starting room where I had to use them. Yeah, all the way back to the first room in the game and this pitch black corner on the side here. That's where they need to go. Yeah, something which could have been easily avoided if the game simply had a fucking map screen. And yes, I know that this is by design, and there are other indie survival horror games out there that don't have maps as well, but none of them are anywhere near as complex as Haydee 3 is, not by a long shot. I don't know, man, like there's just really no excuse for this kind of thing, and even the oldest survival horror titles would incorporate maps, you know, that showed off those areas of interest and other important landmarks. If it wasn't for my obsessive compulsive nature when it comes to survival horror, I would have given up on this thing hours ago. But again, a lot like the second game, I just couldn't stop playing this. But let me tell you something, dog, it all pales in comparison to that final area. Now, I'm not going to spoil it, but it's like a final gauntlet of enemies, easily a couple of dozen, if not more. And if you don't have enough ammo and health stockpiled away for this from having played sparingly for the last few hours, well, then you're most likely going to be fucked. And the reason for that is because for this entire last area, the game just stops giving you any more items.
What?
No health, no ammo, no hand jobs, nothing.
Bro, what are you talking about, man?
And I hate to bring out the comparisons again, but compare it to, you know, every single other survival horror game ever made, or even just other games in general. How you almost always get resources towards the end of the game, considering the whole thing's been building up to this point and ultimately its biggest challenges. It's like, imagine if in the original Resident Evil, if once you got to the lab with all the chimeras and the fight against the Tyrant, and you had to instead make do with whatever you had left over from the mansion. I mean, they don't even give you any ammo here before the final boss fight. There is at least a fair bit of replayability with this one, considering the amount of achievements it's got, not to mention the option to replay it on the hardcore difficulty, which lowers the amount of ammo you find, not to mention including limited saves. But the best thing about this game, much like the last couple, is gonna come from the modding community. And already there's so many cool looking mods, despite it only having dropped a few days ago. I mean, you got the basic cosmetic ones like modding in Crystal from Star Fox, Felicia from Darkstalkers, or Cammy from Street Fighter, or even just modding in the Cyborg from the first game. Just another classic example of men of culture from around the world coming together, putting everything else aside to invest their talents into the greater good. More than that though, there's a few mods here that objectively improve the gameplay. Like a camera mod that lets you choose from a bunch of different options, many of which are zoomed out, you know, in case you find that base FOV too low. Along with including a first-person view, which not only looks great, but plays surprisingly well. And in fact, some of the smoother, more cinematic clips I've used in this video were from this mod. There's another one which makes it so that the vending machines drop soda, which restores your health points. Another one that makes it so your character actually holds her weapon in her hand at all times, as well as giving it a much needed flashlight attachment. One of the more recent ones I found adds in a parkour roll, so when you land from a height, it can reduce fall damage, similar to the one from Mirror's Edge. Or how about a mod that makes the dodge roll knock enemies backwards, so you don't get trapped into corners every time you're ambushed. You know, just a bunch of objectively small improvements like this, which honestly are things that probably should have been included by default, you know, with it being a sequel. It all just comes back to what I said at the start of the video, man, how I'm still not sure if this game is an absolute masterpiece or a complete disaster. I mean, even though I spent over 30 hours with it, it absolutely has a whole bunch of problems, combination of which are and aren't by design. And I don't know, like, I really find it hard to suggest that people play something that often is this unfair and cheap. You know how in horror movies when they show someone in an asylum and they're just scribbling all this nonsense on the wall? And it's like whatever's going through their head makes perfect sense, right? But to the rest of us mere mortals watching from the sidelines, it looks like the ramblings of a crazy person. Yeah, well, that's often what Haydee 3 feels like. It'd be like what had happened if a Russian chess grandmaster got caught in a lab explosion and turned into a supervillain. Only his superpower was creating incredibly difficult video games. And Haydee 3 was his first attempt at subjugating the entire population. And look, like overall, there is a great game in there, somewhere. You just gotta ask yourself before you play it if you've got the mental fortitude.
Surprise, motherfucker!